This is the sermon for June 12th, 2022, and I'm going to continue talking about the Sabbath, and these are from a little book that Abraham Heschel wrote. I think it was published in 1951, and his daughter has written the introduction, and I've got some quotes from that, and I've put a lot of it into my own words because the language is a little bit difficult. So first I'll read from Exodus 20, 8 through 11. Observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Work 6 days and do everything you need to. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to God, your God. Don't do any work, not you, nor your daughter, nor your son, nor your maid, nor your servant, nor your animals, not even the foreign guest visiting in your town. For in 6 days God made heaven, earth, and sea, and everything in them, then rested on the seventh day. Therefore God blessed the Sabbath day and set it apart as a holy day. And from Isaiah 58, 13 and 14. If you don't use my holy Sabbath day for personal advantage, if you treat the Sabbath as a day of joy, God's holy day as a celebration, if you honor it by refusing business as usual, making money, running here and there, then you'll be free to enjoy God. Well, I hope that you hear the sense of wonder, celebration, and joy in these descriptions, especially the Isaiah description of the Jewish Sabbath. Now, they had been away in exile. The people had been away, and they returned to their land. They're trying to rebuild against a lot of difficulty. And Isaiah is trying to tell them, rejoice in the Sabbath. Don't work 7 days, no matter how immediate and urgent the work seems to be. Enjoy the Sabbath day, and then you'll be free to enjoy God. So, no doubt, Jesus had similar aspects, or at least the same prayers as Abraham Heschel did in his modern day. Yeah, at least he had the same prayer over the wine, the Kiddush cup, in his Sabbath celebrations. Heschel's daughter said, when my father raised his Kiddush cup on Friday evenings, closed his eyes, and chanted the prayer sanctifying the wine, I always felt a rush of emotion as he chanted with an old sacred family melody. He blessed the wine and the Sabbath with his prayer, and I also felt he was blessing my life and that of everyone at the table. I treasured those moments. So she goes on to say, Friday evenings in my home were the climax of the week, as they are for every religious Jewish family. My mother and I kindled the lights for the Sabbath, and all of a sudden I felt transformed emotionally and even physically. After lighting the candles in the dining room, we would walk into the living room, which had windows looking west, and we would marvel at the sunset that soon arrived. The sense of peace that came upon us as we kindled the lights was created in part by the hectic tension of Friday's preparation for the beginning of Sabbath, which my father often said was just as important as the Sabbath day itself. During the busy mornings, my mother would shop for the groceries, and in the afternoons, the atmosphere grew increasingly nervous as she cooked. My father came home from his office an hour or two before sunset to take care of his own preparations, and as the last minutes of the work week came to a close, both my parents were in the kitchen frantically trying to remember what they might have forgotten to prepare. Had the kettle boiled? And was the oven turned off? Then suddenly it was time. 20 minutes before sunset, whatever hadn't been finished in the kitchen, we simply left undone as we lit the candles and blessed the arrival of the Sabbath. Now, we've all seen Fiddler on the Roof, and the women bring the Shekinah, the glory of God, into the Sabbath at the beginning by lighting the candles. And so you've all seen that ritual done. So Heschel's daughter goes on to say, "My father writes that the Sabbath comes like a caress, wiping away fear, sorrow, and somber memories. Our family walked to synagogue Saturday morning. My father led Friday evening prayers at home, and our dinners were usually quiet, slow, and relaxed. My parents would occasionally invite a few friends or colleagues to Shabbat dinner. Now, Shabbat is just another word for Sabbath. The meal was always the same. Our symbolic braided bread came from a local bakery, and my mother made chicken soup, roast Cornish hen, salad, and vegetables. For dessert, my father would peel a golden, delicious apple, trying to keep the peel in one piece, and we would share apple chunks. I love that. My dad used to try to keep the peel in one piece for us kids, and we had fun with it. And then he'd cut apple pieces and hand them out. So I really identify with that part of their ritual. Now, Heschel's daughter goes on to say, "My mother was not an enthusiastic cook, and my father followed a salt-free diet, so the food was not thrilling. Still, at the beginning of the meal, my father lifted his fork, looked at me, and said, 'Mommy is a good cook.' There were braided silver spice holders, a gift from a family member, with myrtle and eucalyptus for smelling the fragrance just before the prayer over the wine. So not only do you have beautiful things and the candles lit, but you have the smell of spices. And I don't know what myrtle smells like, but eucalyptus is a wonderful smell. And so I love that they did that just before the prayer over the wine." Well, she goes on to say, "My father, being a scholar from Germany, a refugee in the U.S. during the rise of the Nazis," so he came just before the war. "A refugee in the U.S. during the rise of the Nazis would occasionally entertain German and Eastern European scholars who had also come to the U.S. They might mention the names of Jewish scholars who had gone to Israel or other countries or had perished during the time of the Nazis. They sometimes noted famous non-Jewish scholars who my father had admired, but then who turned out to be Nazis. And that came out well after the war with a book that was published. My parents and their peers remained shocked for 20 or 30 years after the end of the war at these events. They did not discuss the murder process of the Holocaust, and the word Shoah, which is Holocaust in Hebrew, did not exist back in those days. On the Sabbath, my father did not read or discuss secular books. Now, he was a theologian, a Jewish theologian, and a philosopher, and he wrote widely on many topics. My father did not read or discuss secular books, but turned instead to the Hebrew religious texts. Writing was forbidden, so my father would mark the passages he wanted to return to later in the week. Those paper clips were a gift to me long after my father had died. On Shabbat morning, they would walk to the synagogue for service and walk home discussing the sermon with colleagues. The walk took longer because my father would stop to discuss a point and then resumed walking when finished. Lunch on the Sabbath was informal and light-hearted, a time for joking and teasing. After lunch, my parents took their weekly nap, followed by tea and a walk in Riverside Park across the street from the apartment where they lived. They would meet more friends and colleagues also taking their afternoon strolls. And reading about that reminded me that in small towns, I think, now this is before my time, but I think they used to walk around town, greet neighbors. Porches were on the front porch, not in the back. And so people would sit on their front stoop or their front porch, or they would walk around and they would talk to neighbors. And so I love that the Jewish community lived close enough together, much like a small town, even if they were in New York. So I love that community happened even in the walk, the stroll around the park. So, yeah, so Sunday morning, let's see, and then the long Friday evening would be spent drinking tea and talking and reading quietly, especially if Sabbath started in the afternoon, like during the winter. They would have a much longer evening of dark during Sabbath. Sunday morning was the start of the work week, and my father was either teaching classes or writing, and my mother would be practicing the piano. So this book on Shabbat was published during a time that culturally Jews were being assimilated rapidly into American secular culture, and they seemed to be embarrassed by public expressions of Jewishness. There was a rejection of the mystical traditions and religious scholarship during that time after the war. They wanted a religionless Judaism. And I sense that people today want a religionless Christian tradition, or being Christianity. Yeah, they don't really want the religious part of it. They'll take the trappings. They'll take Christmas and Easter, but no, not the religious part of it. So the Jewish people wanted it without God or faith or belief. For them, the Sabbath interfered with jobs, socializing, shopping, and simply being American. Again, that sounds very familiar. And she goes on to say, my father didn't scold or instruct or argue with this growing trend toward the secular. Later on, and in the 50s and late 50s, early 60s, clergy and religious leaders across the board began to argue for returning to Sabbath practices or a simpler Sunday or Saturday in order to have sociological or psychological health, to make us calmer, to strengthen religious community, or to hold family together. But Heschel's daughter says, my father didn't agree with any of that. He saw it very differently. And he saw Sabbath as not for its use in practical ways. No, very different. My father spoke of the gift of Sabbath for freedom, for liberty from the grind and slavery of the material world. Christianity built massive cathedrals in material space, in the material world, over generations. Judaism honored the architecture of time. I'm going to say that again. They didn't build cathedrals or anything like it. Instead, they celebrated and honored the architecture of time. So beautiful. And when they did that, they honored Sabbath because God and Sabbath honored us, not the reverse. Now that takes a twist in the mind to get. It wasn't that the people honored Sabbath. It's that Sabbath honored us. And we entered into Sabbath because it was a gift to us, not that we made it a gift or made it useful or utilitarian. So Sabbath invites us into the holiness of time and eternity, and Sabbath makes us holy, set apart in God, in eternity, now. So humans want to master and control the material world, but our control stops short at the border with time. And we talked about that last week. We talked about how we think we can control everything because we seem to be controlling the material world pretty well. And then we think we can control time, but we can't. And in fact, when we control the material world overly much, it controls our time and it controls us. And stuff controls us rather than us controlling stuff. And so, yeah, Heschel saw it very differently. It wasn't for the use of humans. It was for our entering into the sacred space of time. So think for a moment about this. If you don't enter into the pleasure and wonder of eternity now, simply being in God's presence, simply being, period, full stop, then how could you enjoy being in eternity after death? So we can practice enjoying being in God's presence and experiencing eternity now, and then we'll enjoy it after this life as well. Sabbath invites us into the holiness of time and eternity now. Humans want to master and control the material world, but as I said, we do not control time. So if we want to control and accumulate things or material reality, we become enslaved to it and to our notions of becoming like God, making and creating. And we fall into that trap all the time. We think we are like God. And Heschel's daughter says, "My father said it is not lawful to kindle a fire on the Sabbath, and it is forbidden to kindle the fire of righteous indignation on the Sabbath." So think about that with opposing political views. If you can't kindle a fire, you are not going to kindle the fire of indignation over how horrible those other people are or that other political view is. Instead, we celebrate Sabbath rest for the body, soul, mind, and strength. It could be a sin to be sad on the Sabbath. Being lost in sorrow is work, and we need a break even from the sorrow of loss and the work of grief. And so Sabbath invites you into joy, even if you're in the midst of grief. It's like a little break. It's like when we laugh in the midst of grief. It doesn't make the grief disappear. It's just that we get to let go of the tensions of grief for a while. Creating Sabbath begins with a sense of longing, craving Sabbath. It begins with a sense of longing. So this is also Heschel's idea. You long for the beauty and the joy of Sabbath. Do we long for it? Do we long for the wonder and creativity and joy of Sabbath, of simply being in God's presence? This turns our expectations around, that Sabbath holds us. We do not hold the Sabbath. Sabbath holds us. It isn't enough to observe the laws of Sabbath, just like anything else. No matter how perfectly you observe every law, you'll never get it perfect. And it's the spirit of Sabbath that matters more. So think about the 6 days. Can you live as if there is no Sabbath on the 7th? Can you struggle and fight and keep going and never rest during those 6 days? And then suddenly you get the 7th day as a Sabbath? Are you ready for rest if you do that? So on every day in reality, all that we are, all that we have belongs to God. So we could remember and practice that at least on the 7th day. I'm learning to catch myself all during the week. I'm learning to catch myself with muscles tensed because I'm worried about things, or I'm trying to get more things done in the time that's available. And I'm catching myself, and I'm breathing, and I'm relaxing into God's presence as if it were Sabbath now. And I think our culture taught me to tense but there's always one more thing and one more thing and one more thing. And the treadmill of tensing toward the future is never ending. In a way, I'm joining with God's Sabbath in each moment and moving toward taking a Sabbath each week. I want to create rituals and time. I think we need both, Sabbath in every moment and Sabbath one day a week. What do you think? Can we go against what the world says? Can we go against what American culture says? Can we break that constant need and pushing? I think we can. Amen.